I was born and I grew up in Pongo when I was young. In the early 60s or mid 60s, my friend Achai used a sampan and we rode. Finally, after maybe an hour and a half or so, I saw a piece of land in front. I said, wow, that is the place that we're going to go. And true enough, he told me that it was Coney Island. And this was the first time I saw Coney Island. You could actually see a lot of mangrove. The island was just a big chunk of mangrove, actually. This was basically mangrove swamp, you know. There are no casuarina trees over there. So I've done a survey here, and I found that there are almost like 2,000 casuarina trees. And Singapore only has about 3,000 of this casuarina tree. And we're really puzzled why there are so many casuarina trees on this island itself. It's a mystery. It's really a mystery to me.
Oh, okay, so up top, if you can see, the white-bellied sea eagle nest is up top over there. The white-bellied sea eagle is one of the largest eagles that we have in Singapore. You often see it perching in the tallest trees. In the case of Coney Island, it's going to be the Casuarina tree. Coney Island is just completely covered in Casuarina tree. It has leaves that are like pine needles, even though it's not a pine tree. And it's relatively sparse. And so in comparison to some of like the forest reserves in Singapore, it's much easier to see birds here because it's easy to look through the leaves to see the birds. It's like the whole place is practically one Casuarina forest.
The history of the casuarina tree is very rich in Singapore. So the first recorded casuarina specimens was actually collected by Mr. R.W. Hallett, and he's a school principal of Raffles Institution and also an avid plant collector. He actually recorded even and collected the seed of casuarina tree as early as 1886. The casuarina tree seed were actually stored in the Singapore Botanic, the herbarium itself. But here I have a map that's actually drawn by the Portuguese, dated as early as 1604. And it's also known as Tanjung Ru. And Tanjung Ru today is still existing in Singapore. Tanjung Ru in Malay, Ru means casuarina. This could be one of the unofficial or earliest record that the casuarina tree actually did exist much earlier than we thought here.
The reason that this road is named Tanjung Ru is because of Pokok Ru, or the Malay name for the Casuarina tree, which was said to grow here wild and naturally back in the day when this area actually was the coast. So this area actually used to be by the sea. Not too long ago, up till the 80s, it was a major place for shipbuilding and repairs, though that moved to Jurong back in the 80s, and now it's a residential area. Back in the day, Casuarina trees grew along this area, and it would have made sense. The Casuarina tree is a coastal species. We do see it in other places in Singapore, like East Coast Park.
Today's Tanjung Ru has been reclaimed. So the sandy beach are gone and there are no casuarina trees over there. Now Coney Island is a mangrove island, and I wonder how the casuarina tree today has grown over at Coney Island.
My father used to bring me to many places across Singapore. He used to tell stories. And I think this really made these places come alive. I'm a blogger. I'm also the author of a couple of books. I try to piece things together to find what went on. What's its history? Who lived here? What happened? So Coney Island, I think it's a pretty misunderstood place from a historical viewpoint. What we know as Coney Island today was Pulau Serangoon in the past.
So it's actually a Malay word. Pulau means island, and Sa means one, and Ranggong was a reference to a marsh bird.
There are different ideas of how Serangoon got its name, but one of the most widely accepted theories is that it's named after a bird, the burung ranggong. Now, the exact species is debated, but most knowledgeable people who weighed in on this think it's some sort of marsh bird, perhaps a water hen or rail heron type bird. But the very fact that Coney Island, its original name really is Pulau Serangoon, and Serangoon may well be named after a marsh bird, points to the fact that Coney Island, or much of the original Coney Island, was a marshy habitat. I guess anybody who's doing science, it's almost kind of like a little bit of sleuth work, detective work. Because you're just trying to sieve out different ideas or reading clues. What does nature show and what is she hiding? And Coney Island is different, unexpected type of forest. Marshy habitats, they're waterlogged. Marshy areas also tend to have very low levels of oxygen in the soil. That's a really challenging type of environment. Add to that the fact that this marsh at Pulau Serangoon that had the tides coming through means that it was doubly challenging because this was salt water. So add the salt, the low oxygen, the constant waterlogging, and you can basically write off most plants being able to survive there. Not a single Casuarina can be able to live in the marsh. The conditions just aren't right. How did those Casuarina trees get there?
A very famous pair of brothers were known as the Haw-Pa brothers, Aw Boon Haw and Aw Boon Pa, came to Singapore and sold a certain ointment that we know today as tiger balm. Started with Aw Boon Haw, who was a guy peddling this ointment that his father had created.
He was the kind of marketing genius behind tiger balm. And in fact, his name, Haw, means tiger. This ointment became a hit worldwide. And as a result, he became very wealthy. But he also gave back to society. And he gave millions of dollars to charitable causes. This was in China, in Hong Kong, in Bangkok, where he gave to medical purposes, to education. I think the sum of money that was involved amounted to something like 7 times what it cost to build Kallang Airport in Singapore. And I think Kallang Airport cost something like $8 million to build back in the 30s. So you might want to think of them as the crazy rich Asians of the 1920s.
In the mid-30s, they decided to buy Coney Island. And because they were so well known, the island, which was originally called Pulau Serangoon, became known as Haw-Pa Island.
They built a little villa there, which became quite well known for these wonderful soirees. And that villa stands to this day. The Aw brothers, they must have known about plants because they use all kinds of botanicals in tiger balm, right? But when they purchased Pulau Serangoon and built their villa, Pulau Serangoon was a small, marshy, basically mangrove island. Even if they planted Casuarina, Casuarina wouldn't have survived on that island. To suggest that the origin of Casuarina Forest on Coney Island today can be traced back to the stewardship of the island by the All brothers, I don't think that's very likely.
So those days, I have a group of friends, about 20 of us, and we all love the outdoor life and we love the sea. What is important and memorable to me is that with the time where I was in my late, about 20 plus, we have a group of about 20 of us, and after the Sunday church service, we gather our friends. Hey, today you want to go Coney? And what I do is that I establish a boatman. His name is Tak Eng, have his number. I make a call and say, hey, can you wait for us at the jetty at 10:30? They say, sure. So we're going to make our way here, and then from exactly this spot here, a faithful boat will always be here. We'll take it and it will go across here between 15 to 20 minutes. You drop us there, then we will have like picnic, fishing, crabbing, catching of shells, and of course we pack our food there. So much fun. We go there almost like every week. Coney Island is our island, we call it. There were hardly any people there. One of the nights when we were here and it was pouring, very heavy. And somebody says there's a bungalow inside the island. So I say, is it? Let's go and explore. So with a torchlight. And we really found the bungalow. And that night we had a very, very comfortable rest there. It was not the best of it. The bungalow was already broken down, but certain parts are still, the rain won't get us, and we have a good shelter there until the next morning there. Owned by the Haupa family. The island was actually quite small by the shoreline. Probably it would take you about less than 30 minutes just to walk around the island, to the extent that we did actually swim around the island at that time.
Coney Island used to be only 13 hectares in size. Something must have happened. During the war, Boon Pa passed on. Boon Hall was quite saddened by it. Sometime around 1950, the Haupa family sold the island to this businessman by the name of Gulam Mahmud.
He wanted to develop Coney Island to the light of Coney Island in New York City.
Some scream, some grow big,
With a big dance hall, with a bar, with chalet for people to stay.
The pop culture of the day was also greatly influenced by America. Singaporeans all looked towards the United States as a marker of fun and leisure as well.
Because he's a businessman, he wanted to let the people know about it. So it was all over the news. And it seems people got wind of it. They know the place as Coney Island. Unfortunately, after 3 years of operations, it did not turn up to what is expected. However, the name was so catchy, Coney Island still maintained. And today, it is just known as Coney Island.
The island then got sold to a succession, sort of a parade of businessmen, none of whom could really turn a profit from the purchase of this island.
So in 1971, this Thai businessman had put it on sale, asking price of about $1 million.
Some of the weekends, there are a few diehards, like a few of us, who decided to visit Coney Island. So what do? Now behind me, you can see that stretch there is actually a very narrow stretch. So 3 or 4 of us will be putting our clothing into a plastic bag, put it on our head, and we just swim across the 200 meters over there. But there was one incident that was really funny. There were only 3 of us, and we decided to go to Coney Island. We found a tree stump that's big enough. We put our 3 packs of plastic inside the food and hide it. Decided to swim around the whole island.
By the time we finished the round, we were so tired and so thirsty, and we went back to where the food is. But we remember seeing some boys running around as well. So, lo and behold, when we look at our food, yeah, the food was still there, but the drinks were gone. We were so thirsty, but what to do? The island at that time was still all mangroves. Mangroves are very, very thick undergrowth. It is really impossible to walk through because there's no path. It's actually quite dangerous to walk into there because of mud, all the roots and all the blocking there. There's no true road. Unless you swim in the water, that's what we did to swim around the island itself. There were hardly any Casuarina tree, mainly mangrove vegetations.
So it's a mystery how Casuarina tree today can grow in Coney Island.
The 3,000 or so Casuarina trees that are found across all of Singapore, 2,000 of them are on Coney Island, which is only something like 0.002 of the 720 square kilometers that make up Singapore. Why, on such a small little speck, we have the bulk of Casuarina living there and not elsewhere? What's the origin of this forest? I'm standing in front of a couple of mangrove trees. You can tell this is called Bruguiera, but what gives it away as mangroves is, first of all, their roots are in the water. And the other thing is this has these classic mangrove roots, what are called the knee roots, where the kink at the top of the root is spongy tissue, which allows the roots to breathe in an otherwise muddy and oxygen-poor environment. So this is waterlogged, marshy ground. Just a few meters behind me, there you can see a few Casuarina trees, and there's the Casuarina Forest behind. That's not marshy ground, that's dry ground. So even though the distance is very minimal between these two vegetation types, they could be worlds apart. Waterlogged, not waterlogged. There are two distinct soil types on this island. Could the soil hold the secret to the Casuarina Forest's origins here on Coney Island?
In 1972, PSA acquired the island.
PSA found the opportunity that a Thai owner wanted to sell the island. So they took the opportunity to buy over this island with the idea of wanting to develop the Coney Island into a resort again. Because at that time in Singapore, we have so few islands, and it'd be nice to have a lot of place for Singaporeans to relax, like a picnic area. When they want to develop the island to whatever they want to do for recreation, the place was just too small. So the idea was out there to expand or to reclaim the land to 10 times the size of the original island itself.
Modestly sized, mangrove-dominated 13-hectare island was just not big enough to match the ambitions the authorities had for this place. So they turned to the next best thing, which was used back then and still today, land reclamation.
I operate a lab that does soil testing. From 1819 up to present day, Singapore's land mass has increased by 26%. Singapore is made up of few geological formations. We have the Kallang Formation, which is all marine clay, very soft. And then you go to the west, we have the Jurong Formation. Those are all you get hard soil. And then you go up north, you have Bukit Timah Formation, where you have the Granite Formation. We have to understand the nature of the soil. There are different composition of the soil, from gravel to sand to silt and clay. With regard to Coney Island, the nature of the soil used for reclamation, we call it good earth. Good earth is soil that is cut from mountain. Any earth that they cut, they just pour it over the sea. What you call good earth is what you see on the surface right now in most parts of Singapore.
Walking into Coney, it strikes me as it doesn't look the same as all the other areas in Singapore.
So in the 1970s, PSA wanted to create this place for recreation for Singaporeans and anybody visiting Singapore to go and participate in fun activities. But Coney Island, wasn't big enough at the time. So to create this bigger space where people could go and do activities, the way to do that is by reclaiming land. So what PSA did was they take sand just like this from other parts of Singapore and deposited it in Coney Island, actually increasing the land of Coney Island by 10 times. So you can see this is the sand that they would have used to make the land in Coney Island much bigger than it is right now. And you can see that it's very, very pure white sand. And that's because there's very little nutrients inside of it. Actually, this is called, in reclamation terms, good earth. The irony is that it's not very good earth. There's not a lot of nutrients inside of it. And if you think about Casuarina trees trying to put their roots right down into the sand, they'd have to go really, really far to even try and find some nutrients and still wouldn't find any. So unlike when we have normal types of soil that you're more used to seeing, this is very, very nutrient-rich as opposed to the nutrient-poor sand. This nutrient-rich soil has a lot of organic material inside of it. It has leaf litter, it has bark, it has broken down roots, lots of different things to make it this chocolatey color that you see here. And so that's kind of nutrient-rich earth. Compared to this good earth that's nutrient poor. So then the question then becomes, well, how did the Casuarina trees manage to dominate Coney Island when all they had to try and attach to was this very nutrient poor sand? How were they able to dominate the ecosystem? That really becomes the mystery here as to how the Casuarina trees became the dominant species on Coney Island. This seems like the main reason or the main thing to try and solve.
So back then, behind me, the island, there were not so many of these Casuarina trees. It was quite bare. After a while being here, we realized that they were doing some reclamation. And that's where they have a lot of sandy beaches, and that's where the Casuarina trees start to grow here. And it was probably a decade later when I brought my kid here, and I realized that this whole island was populated by Casuarina tree. And they were maybe about 10 to 15 meters high, the whole island was full of this.
Casuarina seeds could have come from Malaysia across the Johor Strait, because Coney Island would be one of the first places that's not very, very urbanized on the coastline that they might have settled. It could have come from wind dispersal. It could have been carried by bats. They could have floated or come by wave action. Could have been carried by birds. There's lots of different ways in which they might have arrived at Coney. This is what happens during reclamation. Remember, here we've got our good earth, our soil that we use to reclaim land. And here, if you can imagine, this is the sea around Coney Island. So what we do, we take our good earth and we deposit it into the sea where we want our island to grow or where we want our land to be reclaimed. And so you can see, as we're depositing the good earth into the sea, it's really creating murky water, and it's not settling immediately. As we add more and more, the murkier the water is, the longer it takes to settle. And this is exactly what happens when we try and reclaim land as well. It takes about 15 to 20 years for the land to settle and become stable enough to build anything on. And that's exactly what happened with Coney Island. During that time, while we were waiting for it to stabilize, nature took over.
If the question is, how do plants grow on reclaimed land? At first, that might be kind of a head scratcher. You might think Casuarina must have some sort of superpowers almost in order to thrive under these nutrient-poor conditions. Let me show you the secret to Casuarina's success. These are what are called root nodules, and if I dig around a little bit, there's a little piece of root to which the nodules are attached. And these nodules actually develop out of the tips of the roots of Casuarina, but in these roots are bacteria known as Frankia. Frankia is a bacteria that's able to take nitrogen gas from the air and through a chemical process convert that into what's called an organic form that living things like the Casuarina plant can use. The equivalent would be if every time we took a breath of air, we were able to use that nitrogen gas to build muscle. The air that we breathe is 80% nitrogen. Nitrogen is so important. It's the stuff from which proteins, for example, are made. But nitrogen gas to almost all living things is inert. We just breathe it in, breathe it out. But thanks to this amazing partnership, the bacteria provides the organic nitrogen fertilizer for the Casuarina. The Casuarina provides a safe home for the bacteria to thrive. Casuarina is able to not only survive, but it's able to thrive in this otherwise desolate, sandy environment. But it's not just the roots that are so amazing. If we think about where Casuarina lives, sandy coast, and sand is not a very solid, substrate. On the shore, subject to salt spray and to heavy gusts of wind, and you soon begin to realize that there has to be much more to Casuarina to allow it to survive where it does.
One of the things that's special about Casuarina is it has this very flexible foliage, in addition to very flexible branches. So in contrast to some of these broadleaf species, in a strong wind, the leaves will tend to aggregate into a cone that has a larger cross-section against the flow, and therefore a higher drag. Whereas something like Casuarina, with these very flexible branches and this fine foliage, will tend to form a sort of tube that presents a much smaller drag against the wind. And this is important in a gusty environment, and it's relatively easy for either foliage to be broken or for a whole tree to topple.
So in the sandy soil, like at Coney Island, the tree really could topple over if it's got too much drag?
That's right.
If you look at a Casuarina tree, you'll see how it goes from a big, sturdy, resilient trunk, then very rapidly into smaller and very fine, wispy branches. Most trees do their photosynthesis through broad leaves. You can imagine these would easily be stripped off in a sudden storm. But the fact that the work of making food is actually transferred from leaves to very thin branches allow them to continue making food without any disadvantage in these strong winds because there are no big leaves to be stripped off and damaged. Casuarina therefore have an advantage over other plants in an environment that would be virtually impossible for other things to colonize.
So this is the fruit from the Casuarina tree, and these are the branches. And so each of these fruits actually is made up of several individual fruits. There's about 50 per bulb. And then each individual fruit also has seeds inside of that fruit. And so per bulb, there can be hundreds of seeds that will get dispersed. And an interesting thing about the Casuarina trees is that the seeds are wind dispersed. So the seeds will have small wings on the side of them that when the wind picks up, it means that they get blown far and wide away from where they started. And that's one of the ways in which the Casuarina trees are so far spread around Coney Island, because the seed dispersal is wind dispersed, and so it spreads far and wide around. So imagine a single tree might have thousands of these seeds just waiting to be dispersed by the wind during a fruiting season. Because of that, they are really prolific in how widespread they are and how far they've reached across Coney Island. Very prolific in terms of their dispersal and also their propagation.
So in any natural environment, there's always going to be some element of competition, particularly in tropical environments. And Coney is no different. There are a couple of ways in which the Casuarina trees have tried to overcome and adapt to this competition. One way, a physical way, is that they drop these branches onto the floor. And you can see that with enough branches, it really makes a mat on the floor. If I shine a torch, you can see you can't see much light coming through. And so what that means is that there's not enough light coming through to any of the seeds that might have already fallen. The second way is a chemical way, also linked to the branches on the floor. Once the branches have fallen, they release a chemical that actually suppresses any of the seeds that might have already fallen to the floor. So it stops any seeds from growing. So there you see you have two main ways that the Casuarina trees have adapted to be the most competitive species on Coney Island, both physically and chemically.
Biomimicry is basically learning from nature. It's the realizations that many of the problems that we face as humans have really been solved by nature. So one of these problems is the water shortage problems. It turns out that many organisms have developed different strategies to solve water shortage problems. The Casuarina trees are able to harvest water in the form of fog. And this is very helpful for them because they live in a very dry environment where there's little rainfall, and they depend very much on this fog for their survival.
So the first thing is that they have these long, almost needle-like twigs.
What this geometry does is that it actually increases the surface area given the same amount of space. When that happens, there is a higher chance that droplet will contact the surface and get trapped. And the second property is that they allow the wind that carries the fog to filter through.
Normal flat leaves are not very good because they behave like a solid wall. When the wind blows, it just goes sideways and does not pass through. Whereas if you have cylindrical needle-like twigs, it behaves like a net and water is deposited as the wind passes through.
And when they pass through, they tend to deposit the fog. So it acts almost like a net that helps you collect water from the air.
Most people may not realize this, but Casuarina are what are known as pioneer species. Of all our native plants, perhaps only 10% belong to this pioneer category. Well, what is a pioneer? Pioneers essentially are plants that are able to colonize open spaces. In order to do that, they have to be able to withstand the intense sunlight, the searing heat, and also grow quickly enough to keep ahead of the competition in a race to the canopy. All plants need light, but pioneers need full 100% sunlight, and that is a stressful condition for most plants. So pioneers, like Casuarina, are really considered hardy plants. They can withstand the high temperatures, the prolonged exposure to this intense tropical sunlight, conditions that would deter or certainly prevent most other plants from thriving. In the case of Coney Island, after reclamation, as we know, they let the land sit and stabilize, creating a kind of Wild West where Casuarina Tree just raced to claim this soil and to form a forest, a kind of live fast, die young kind of lifestyle. These tall trees, some of them 40 meters tall, or about the height of a 13-story building, they're not very old. They're much younger than me because Coney Island wasn't reclaimed that long ago. So again, these Casuarina trees colonized, grew very quickly, reaching these very magnificent heights, forming this magical Casuarina Forest.
So there were a real confluence of factors that made Coney Island a perfect habitat for the Casuarina trees. Firstly, the reclaiming with the good earth, making it barren soil, and then
The Casuarina trees being pioneer species who were able to colonize that type of nutrient-poor soil. And then the amount of time that it took for the soil to settle being enough time for the Casuarina trees as pioneer species to colonize that particular piece of land. And then the Casuarina trees having all these adaptations that make them very, very competitive in this particular area. All of that mixed together made it a perfect storm of events for Casuarina trees to really take over Coney Island. So obviously Coney was reclaimed so that PSA could build resorts and have this area for recreation. And it was only because that didn't happen that the Casuarina trees were able to colonize, grow, and take over Coney. So then why didn't PSA do that? You know, why do we still have all of these Casuarina trees on Coney Island? Why didn't PSA follow through with what they said they were going to do?
There were a lot of big farms over the western part of Singapore.
There were a lot of development in the 70s. In the west, they were building a new reservoir, Kranji Reservoir, as well as Pandan Reservoir.
The pig farmers has to be relocated.
They found that Punggol was suitable. And as a result, the government reserves about 3 square kilometers for the pig farming there.
So at the peak of it, they produce almost the whole of the Singapore supply of pork itself. So at that time, Punggol also is very famous for seafood as well. All right, there are 3 restaurants over there. So when one wants to go, they have to drive through there, and you will catch the whiff of the smell itself, and it's not so nice. So we used to joke and say, this will be the entree.
The development was so fast that within 3 years, it was almost at full capacity. And then they realized that the pig farming, they create a lot of waste.
The stench, as I say, I grew up in the environment, so I'm kind of able to accept it, but it is not easy. PSA realized that was something that is overwhelming.
So as a result, PSA has to abandon the use of the Coney Island for recreation.
What really changed for Coney Island was this whole idea of HDB moving in, maybe redeveloping it as a space that was to be appended to the main island. In '87, there was this announcement that the PSA was actually deciding to give the space to HDB for their future Punggol plan. That drew quite a number of protests from the general public who felt the island should be kept as it is. In 2002, the URA conducted a study together with some interest groups. They found that it was a kind of a nice space, very rich in vegetation, very rich in flora and fauna. And out of that came this recommendation that because of this green haven, we should keep the island as green as possible, as rustic as possible. And 10 years later, in 2012, NParks actually had a look at it, and they recommended to create ecological park on the island.
So Coney Island is really biodiverse, particularly for the small area that it covers. There's 157 fauna species here, including 80 species of bird, which is really important for conservation purposes. There's also over 80 species of tree here. Nature's a huge part of my life. It's where I come to decompress, it's where I come to de-stress. And even actually a few years ago, a huge storm hit Coney, and the resilience of the biodiversity on Coney Island meant that they could recover quite quickly after the storm had hit.
When I first came to Coney Island, I was actually quite surprised by the Casuarina trees because in Singapore we do not have pine trees. So when I first came here, I was wondering, what are all these trees? Because it's actually very pretty. I realized that creatures big and small call the Casuarina Woodlands their home. This is actually a Malayan tree trunk jumping spider. So these guys can often be found on the surfaces of trees and wood, so they can actually blend in very well because they have amazing camouflage. and they sort of flatten themselves to look inconspicuous as well. They are actually ambush predators. They are actually known for their ability to jump 10 to 50 times their body size. They actually contract muscles in their body. So once blood flows from the body all the way to their legs at a rapid pace, they are able to then bounce off the place that they're standing explosively. After all, they have such amazing eyesight. So they put that amazing eyesight to use and they go around hunting for prey, and they will suddenly just sneak up or just pounce on the prey. So without the Casuarina trees, Coney Island would not be the thriving biodiversity hotspot that it actually is. If you look through the gaps over there, you can see a ball-shaped thing hanging at the top of the Casuarina tree. So that ball-shaped thing is actually a hornet's nest. So hornets actually like to build their nest all the way up where they will not be disturbed. They actually fly around, they look for a suitable tree with bark that looks good, and they start chewing on that bark. So once they chew enough of it, it combines with their spit, and it gives this paper-like material that they go back and then they paste it on the structures that are already present on the nest. And as more hornets do that, their nest slowly comes into shape. As I walked along Coney Island, I found these little pine cone-looking things, which I realized later that were the fruits of the Casuarina tree. Right now, if you look closely at the squirrel front paws, it looks like it's holding some sort of food. I think that's actually a Casuarina fruit. This is how squirrels actually help with seed dispersal. They bring the seeds away from the parent plant only for it to drop somewhere else, and hopefully it might grow into a new tree. Apart from just being able to provide food and shelter for many of the inhabitants of Coney Island, be it big or small, the Casuarina tree actually plays an important role in ensuring the survivability of life on Coney Island.
So one of the starbirds on Coney Island is the Jordan's Bazaar. And so when we first found out that they were here a couple of years ago, you would see like little flocks of birders coming down and staring up at big trees in groups of like 10s and 20s sometimes. So if you ever see groups of photographers just pointing their cameras angled up at the top of a tree, you know what's up, basically. There's a rare bird on top and everyone wants to get a shot of it. The Jordan's Bazaar is actually related to the eagles. And Coney Island is also pretty interesting because you do get a lot of raptor or eagle nests here as well. So the one thing that distinguishes Jordan's Bazaar from the other members of its family is really the crest. It has this big floppy crest that on a whim it can like sort of bring up as well. So that's pretty cute and pretty fascinating for me. So the reason that Coney Island is so famous for Jordan's Bazaar is basically because this is a bird that is rare in Singapore, and there aren't that many reliable locations where we see it regularly every winter to come and perch and hang around for a little bit. There have always been occasions where it comes and stays for a while elsewhere, like Ang Mo Kio Bishan Park or in Changi Business Park. But year after year, Coney Island is the most reliable place to see these birds. So the Casuarina tree actually does have a very important place in my heart because this was really the first tree that I learned to recognize. Many things in Singapore have changed. Our coastline has changed. Names of many places have changed, but this is one place that seems to have stood the test of time.
So the great thing about Coney is all of this biodiversity is there completely accidentally. It's not supposed to be there. PSA was supposed to build recreational areas, and it's only because they didn't do that that this huge amount of biodiversity was able to flourish on Coney Island.
As a nature lover, I always realize that nature is greater than man. So with all this business plan and all this to develop a place, finally, nature still claimed back its place itself.
Well, it is a kind of amazing story, really, if you think about it, that here was this little mangrove island, marshy island, that was bought with an aim to turning it into some sort of profitable enterprise. Casuarina had other ideas. This tree, its superpowers may not only be restricted to surviving under really harsh conditions, but another superpower that it had was it could take this reclaimed land and convince people that it's worth saving as a nature area. Yeah, I guess so, yeah. I'm a Casuarina convert, yeah.